Narcissist Code, uncovered a disturbing truth about narcissistic behavior that most people only recognize when damage is already done. We tend to believe that once a relationship ends, or once we finally assert ourselves, the other person will eventually accept it and move on. But with a narcissist, the psychological rules are reversed. The moment they realize they can no longer control your emotions or manipulate your responses, they do not simply disappear. Instead, they often initiate a final and calculated push designed to undo your healing and destabilize your progress in a very short time. It becomes less about conflict and more about attacking your sense of identity. If you are not aware of this stage, you can easily be pulled back into the very cycle you thought you had escaped. Narcissist Code's research into shadow psychology explains that this type of individual operates through projection, externalizing their own insecurities, flaws, and unresolved shame onto others. They maintain a fragile sense of superiority by making you feel confused, small, or unstable, which allows them to avoid facing their own inner emptiness. As long as you remain reactive, seeking validation, or doubting your own perception, they feel in control and secure. But when you begin to trust your own judgment and stop responding to their emotional bait, the balance shifts. Your independence becomes something they experience as a threat rather than a loss. This is when the dynamic changes into something more aggressive as they attempt to reclaim dominance by any means necessary, including manipulation, distortion of reality, and psychological projection meant to disorient you. They feed on emotional energy, using constant validation as a way to stabilize their fragile internal world. When you start withdrawing attention and no longer provide that steady emotional supply, their internal structure begins to weaken. What follows is a psychological crisis where control feels like it is slipping away, and they react with heightened intensity. The version of you they relied on no longer exists in the same form, which forces them into desperation to restore the old dynamic. This is also where projection becomes more extreme, as they attempt to assign their own unacceptable traits to you in order to confuse your sense of reality. What makes this final stage so confusing is the sheer speed and intensity of their shift. One moment, they can seem emotionally detached, distant, almost indifferent, and then suddenly they shift into a full-on attack on your character, your choices, even your sense of reality. This swing isn't random. It comes from a place of psychological survival. In their internal logic, your strength automatically equals their weakness, and your clarity automatically exposes their flaws. They cannot comfortably exist in a dynamic where you are empowered, because your growth reflects everything they've tried to suppress or avoid within themselves. When you begin to stand fully in your own truth, it doesn't just change the relationship, it dismantles the entire framework they were operating from. What looks like them losing control is actually the collapse of the worldview they depended on to feel superior and secure. When their influence over you starts to fade, their strategy shifts in a more aggressive direction. The usual tactics like confusion, gaslighting, or subtle deception no longer land the way they used to because you've started to see through them. At that point, the focus moves away from your past and toward something deeper. Your individuation, which is your process of becoming your own authentic self, a concept explored in the work of Carl Jung. Instead of recognizing your growth as healing, they interpret it as a threat that needs to be stopped. Your progress is no longer something neutral to them. It feels like a direct rejection. This is where a pattern known as strength shaming begins to appear, where they try to turn your improvements into something you should feel guilty about. Strength shaming is subtle but very intentional. They might say things like, "You've changed and not for the better," or claim you used to be kinder before you became selfish. These statements are not casual observations. They are carefully aimed at destabilizing your confidence in your own transformation. What they're really doing is trying to rewrite your healing story, reframing healthy boundaries as emotional walls and self-respect as arrogance. By doing this, they attempt to create inner conflict, making you question whether becoming stronger actually made you worse. Their goal is to push you back toward the version of you that was easier to influence, easier to guilt, and easier to control, using shame as the tool to reverse your progress. What makes this pattern especially manipulative is how precisely it targets your hard-earned growth. Anything you've worked to improve becomes a focal point for criticism. If you've learned to say no, they call you cold or unkind. If you've rebuilt your confidence, they label it ego or arrogance. If you've learned to speak up for yourself, they frame it as being difficult or confrontational. The intention is always the same: to make your strengths feel like flaws. Over time, this can create a psychological pressure where you start questioning whether your growth is worth the discomfort it brings, which is exactly the reaction they are hoping for. The aim is not just criticism, it's self-doubt strong enough to make you abandon your progress voluntarily. When strength shaming stops working, a different tactic often appears: nostalgic manipulation. This is where they try to pull your attention backward in time, focusing on the early, idealized phase of the relationship. They bring up old memories, inside jokes, and moments that once felt emotionally warm, suggesting that things were better back then. On the surface, it can sound like longing or regret, but underneath it is a calculated effort to reconnect you with a previous version of yourself, one that hadn't fully developed boundaries yet. The goal is to make your current growth feel like a loss, as if becoming stronger somehow cost you happiness, when in reality, it only costs them access to control. The danger of this nostalgia-based manipulation is that it targets a very real human need for comfort and the longing to believe that things can return to a simpler, safer version of a relationship. A narcissist understands how exhausting boundary work can become, especially when you've been holding your ground for a long time. In those moments when you feel drained or emotionally worn out, they often reintroduce carefully framed memories of the good old days. They present the past as if it was peaceful and effortless, while quietly ignoring the imbalance and emotional pressure that actually defined it. This is where doubt begins to creep in, making you question whether your healing has truly improved your life or simply made you more distant or unhappy. If you lose your grounding, you can even start longing for a past version of yourself, forgetting that its comfort came from silence, self-sacrifice, and emotional compromise. It becomes more destabilizing because this tactic is designed to rewrite your identity in real time. The narcissist positions your current self as flawed or unhappy, while idealizing an earlier version of you that was more compliant and easier to influence. This creates internal conflict where you start doubting whether growth made you worse, when in fact it reflects the process of individuation described by Carl Jung, the journey toward becoming a whole and authentic self. From their perspective, your healing is not something to celebrate, but something to resist. They frame your boundaries as distance and your confidence as arrogance, trying to reverse your progress by attaching guilt to your improvement. In reality, they are attempting to pull you back into the version of yourself that was a controllable victim rather than an independent survivor who can no longer be shaped by their influence. The most dangerous escalation of this dynamic is manufactured vulnerability, a tactic where the narcissist uses apparent helplessness to regain access to your empathy and attention. Instead of directly challenging your boundaries, they appeal to your compassion by presenting themselves as overwhelmed, injured, or in crisis. According to Carl Jung's observations on projection and shadow behavior, this form of manipulation allows them to temporarily shift focus away from their own patterns and onto their suffering. These crises are often timed to coincide with moments when you are strongest or closest to detaching, such as after progress in therapy or major personal achievements. The goal is to pull you back into the caregiver role, where your energy is spent repairing their instability instead of maintaining your own growth. In doing so, they turn your empathy into a tool of control, making your kindness feel like obligation rather than choice. To step out of this final psychological pull, you need what Carl Jung described as differentiated compassion, the capacity to recognize another person's pain without turning it into your responsibility to fix it. For people who are naturally empathetic, suffering usually triggers action, but in manipulative dynamics, that reaction becomes the very thing that keeps you stuck. Differentiated compassion means you can see someone's struggle clearly while still holding your boundary. I understand what you're feeling, but I am not the answer to it. It reframes their crisis as a result of their own patterns rather than a reflection of your lack of care. Every time they say, just this once, you have to recognize it is never really once. It is a test of whether your boundaries are stable or still available to be pushed and bent. Narcissists don't simply dislike your strength, they experience it as a threat. As Carl Jung explored in his work on the psyche, your growth functions like a mirror that exposes everything they have not developed within themselves. When you stand firm in your truth, you are no longer playing the role they once assigned to you, and that disruption shakes the entire system of control they relied on. Real power is not emotional detachment or becoming unaffected by manipulation. It is the ability to recognize what is happening in real time and still choose yourself anyway. Instead of asking how you can help them, you begin asking whether helping them will cost you your peace or your identity. That single shift becomes the turning point where approval loses importance and authenticity finally takes priority. Once you reach that level of clarity, the old patterns start losing their grip. Emotional chaos no longer pulls you back in, and attempts at nostalgia, guilt, or crisis begin to feel predictable rather than persuasive. You turn into what feels like a dead signal to them, someone they can no longer emotionally access or control. That is where you begin to reclaim your energy and direction. It is not about winning arguments or proving a point, but about becoming so anchored in your truth that manipulation stops making sense in your reality. You move from reacting emotionally to observing consciously, and that shift is where real freedom starts. Your choices are no longer driven by fear or obligation, but by alignment with who you actually are. At that point, their influence doesn't just weaken, it disappears. Ultimately, the most important realization is that your freedom begins the moment you stop negotiating your boundaries. The more consistently you choose yourself, the less power these patterns have over your emotional world. What once felt confusing starts to feel clear, even predictable. You are no longer living in reaction, but in intention, and that is what genuine psychological independence looks like. If this message helped you see things more clearly, consider staying connected for more insights on emotional resilience and personal growth. This space is built around awareness, healing, and truth. And if someone you know is caught in guilt, confusion, or boundary struggles, sharing this with them might help them recognize patterns they haven't been able to name yet. When people talk about these kinds of dynamics, it helps to ground it in something more stable than labels like narcissist. Because what you're really dealing with is a pattern of control, insecurity, and emotional dependency expressed through behavior. The core issue isn't a specific diagnosis. It's a relationship system where one person tries to regulate themselves through power over another person's emotions. That's why the cycle can feel so intense. It isn't built on mutual understanding, it's built on control, reaction, and reinforcement. One of the most confusing parts is that these dynamics don't stay consistent. They tend to shift depending on whether the other person is getting what they want: attention, validation, emotional reaction, or compliance. When they're getting that, things can look calm or even affectionate. When they aren't, the behavior can change sharply. That inconsistency is what keeps people psychologically engaged because the mind keeps trying to solve the pattern by returning to the moments that felt good, hoping to recreate them. What makes it even harder is the way emotional memory works. The brain tends to store emotionally intense positive moments more vividly than long-term patterns of discomfort or imbalance. So even if the overall experience is draining, the memory of warmth or connection can feel disproportionately strong. That's where nostalgia becomes powerful, not because the past was truly stable, but because the mind selectively highlights the relief moments while downplaying the stress that surrounded them. Another layer is the role of empathy. People who are naturally caring often assume that understanding someone's pain means they should help fix it. In healthy relationships, that instinct is mutual and balanced. But in unhealthy dynamics, that empathy can get redirected into obligation. You start feeling responsible for regulating someone else's emotional state, and over time, that responsibility can quietly replace your own needs. That's where boundaries become critical, not as punishment toward the other person, but as a way of keeping your sense of self intact. When boundaries are introduced, the system naturally resists them because it loses access to the emotional reactions it depended on. That resistance can come in many forms: guilt-inducing language, emotional withdrawal, sudden crises, or attempts to reframe your boundaries as cruelty. What makes this difficult is that it often feels personal, but it's usually more about the loss of control than about who you are as a person. A useful way to understand the shift is to see it as a transition from external regulation to internal regulation. In the earlier dynamic, one person relies heavily on the other to stabilize their emotions. When that stops working, they may try harder to reestablish it, not necessarily out of calculated intent, but because their coping system is being disrupted. That's why the pushback can intensify right when you start becoming more independent. At the same time, your own internal experience starts changing too. As you detach from constant reactivity, there's often a mix of relief and discomfort. Relief because you're no longer emotionally pulled in every direction, and discomfort because your nervous system is adjusting to a new level of calm after prolonged stress. That adjustment period can sometimes be mistaken for doubt, which is why people often get pulled back into old cycles right at the point of progress. The deeper shift happens when you stop interpreting their emotional state as something you have to resolve. You can still care about someone's feelings without stepping into the role of fixing them. That separation is what creates clarity. It allows you to respond based on choice rather than pressure. Over time, that changes the entire structure of the interaction because the dynamic no longer runs on urgency or emotional leverage. Eventually, what you begin to notice is that the strongest pull isn't actually the person, it's the familiar emotional pattern. The intensity, the reconciliation, the hope, the relief, and the tension form a loop that the brain can mistake for connection. Breaking that loop isn't about shutting down empathy. It's about redirecting it toward yourself first, so your decisions aren't made at the expense of your stability. If anything, the real turning point is when clarity starts feeling more important than intensity. Once that shift happens, the need to interpret, fix, or emotionally manage the other person fades, and what's left is simply perspective. After that clarity starts to settle in, another layer often becomes visible: the way your own boundaries were shaped by earlier experiences long before this specific relationship. This is also why leaving or emotionally detaching isn't just a decision, it's an internal reorganization. Part of you is trying to step into stability, while another part is still scanning for emotional shifts, waiting for the next change in tone or behavior. That split attention can create a kind of internal conflict where you know something is wrong, but your emotional reflexes haven't fully caught up yet. It can feel like clarity and doubt existing at the same time, which is one of the most disorienting phases of breaking a cycle. Over time, what begins to shift is your tolerance for emotional volatility. Things that once felt normal, mixed signals, sudden intensity, emotional withdrawal followed by reconnection, start to feel less like connection and more like instability. That change is important because it means your internal standard is updating. You're no longer measuring connection by intensity or emotional charge, but by consistency and emotional safety. Another important shift happens in how you interpret guilt. In these dynamics, guilt is often the emotional bridge that keeps the cycle alive. It doesn't always come from wrongdoing. Sometimes it comes from simply choosing yourself. That kind of guilt can feel convincing because it mimics responsibility. But over time, you start noticing the difference between healthy accountability and emotional pressure designed to pull you back into old roles. One leads to growth and repair where appropriate, the other leads to self-abandonment. As this awareness grows, the relationship itself often becomes less confusing, even if it doesn't immediately become easier. Confusion tends to reduce when you stop trying to find hidden meaning in every shift and instead start observing patterns over time. You begin to see consistency, or lack of it, more clearly. That perspective reduces emotional urgency, which is often what the cycle depends on to keep you engaged. What also becomes more noticeable is how much energy was previously spent on anticipation. In unstable dynamics, a large part of emotional exhaustion comes not just from events themselves, but from constantly predicting them, wondering what mood will appear next, what version of the person you'll encounter, or what response will be safe. When that anticipation starts to fade, a lot of mental space opens up, even before anything externally changes. Eventually, the focus shifts inward in a more stable way. Instead of organizing your behavior around someone else's reactions, you begin organizing it around your own internal signals: fatigue, discomfort, clarity, peace. That shift is subtle, but it's foundational. It's where emotional autonomy starts to replace emotional reactivity. And once that begins to take hold, the relationship dynamic loses one of its most important fuels: uncertainty. Without uncertainty driving interpretation, the pattern stops feeling mysterious and starts feeling repetitive. That's often the point where real detachment becomes possible, not because emotions disappear, but because they no longer override your sense of direction. As that internal shift deepens, something else starts to happen that people don't always expect. The relationship stops being the center of your emotional world, even if the other person is still present in it. Your attention gradually returns to your own life in a more consistent way, and that alone changes the structure of the dynamic. When one person is no longer emotionally orbiting the other, the old push and pull pattern starts to lose its grip. It doesn't collapse all at once, but it becomes less effective over time because there's less emotional reactivity available to feed it. At this stage, you may notice that the same behaviors that once felt confusing or powerful now feel repetitive. The emotional highs don't land the same way, and the emotional lows don't pull you in as deeply. That doesn't necessarily mean you feel nothing. It means your nervous system is no longer interpreting intensity as significance. What used to feel urgent begins to feel predictable, and that predictability is what breaks the emotional spell. A key part of this phase is learning to sit with your own emotional responses without immediately turning them into action. In earlier stages, discomfort often led to over-explaining, over-giving, or trying to restore balance quickly. Now, there's a growing ability to pause and simply observe what you're feeling without automatically assigning yourself responsibility for it. That pause is small, but it changes everything because it interrupts the reflex to self-abandon. You also start to recognize how much mental space was previously occupied by interpretation. In unstable dynamics, people often spend a lot of time decoding tone, timing, silence, and subtle shifts in behavior. It becomes a constant internal analysis. As detachment grows, that need to decode weakens. You stop treating ambiguity as something you must solve, and instead start accepting that not everything requires explanation. That alone reduces emotional fatigue significantly. Another important change is how you relate to apologies, promises, or emotional declarations. Instead of focusing on what is said, you begin paying more attention to what consistently happens. This shift from words to patterns is crucial because it anchors you in reality rather than moments of emotional intensity. It becomes less about whether something sounds sincere in the moment and more about whether behavior aligns over time. At the same time, there can be a strange sense of emotional withdrawal that isn't sadness exactly, but a kind of quiet distancing from the whole cycle. You may feel less interested in resolving things that once felt urgent. This is not indifference in a cold sense. It's more like emotional clarity replacing emotional urgency. The system that once kept you hyper-focused on the relationship starts to power down. Eventually, what becomes most noticeable is that peace feels unfamiliar at first. Not because it's wrong, but because your nervous system is adjusting to a lower level of emotional activation. When chaos has been present for a long time, calm can initially feel like emptiness or uncertainty. But over time, that calm becomes your new reference point, and anything that disrupts it starts to feel less acceptable. And that's where real independence starts to take shape, not as a dramatic break, but as a steady return to yourself, where your decisions are guided less by emotional pressure and more by internal stability. As this process continues, one of the most important changes is that your sense of self stops being organized around reaction. In earlier stages, a lot of emotional energy is spent responding to shifts in someone else's behavior, trying to stabilize the situation, interpret meaning, or regain a sense of connection when things feel uncertain. But over time, that external focus starts to weaken. and your internal world becomes more central again. You begin to notice your own thoughts, needs, and boundaries without immediately filtering them through the other person's mood or response. This is also where emotional dependency begins to lose its structure. Dependency is often maintained not just by attachment, but by repeated cycles of tension and relief. When those cycles stop having the same emotional effect, the dependency naturally weakens. It doesn't always feel like empowerment at first. It can feel unfamiliar, even slightly disorienting, because the emotional system that once created intensity is no longer driving your decisions in the same way. What replaces it is slower but more stable, clarity without urgency. In the end, what all of this points to is not just the breakdown of a specific relationship pattern, but the rebuilding of your internal world. When you step out of cycles that are driven by emotional intensity, unpredictability, and repeated self-doubt, you don't just leave someone psychologically. You start relearning how to trust your own perception again. That is often the real turning point because manipulation of any kind only works as long as your inner signals feel less reliable than the other person's version of reality. The most important shift is that your emotional energy stops being automatically available for reaction. Where there used to be urgency, there is now space. Where there used to be confusion, there is now observation. And where there used to be self-abandonment in the name of keeping peace, there is slowly something else forming, self-reference. You begin to ask what you think before asking what will keep things stable with someone else. That might sound simple, but it is actually a deep structural change in identity. What people often don't expect is that healing doesn't feel like constant empowerment. It often feels like silence, unfamiliar calm, and even emotional flatness at times. That's because your nervous system is no longer living in a state of continuous activation. When you've spent a long time in emotional unpredictability, stability doesn't immediately feel like relief. It can initially feel like absence. But over time, that absence reveals itself as space. Space to think clearly, space to feel without distortion, and space to choose without pressure. Another quiet but powerful change is that you stop negotiating your worth in real time. In unstable dynamics, people often unconsciously try to earn stability through explanation, patience, overgiving, or emotional endurance. As clarity grows, that negotiation ends. You stop trying to convince someone else that your boundaries are valid because your boundaries are no longer up for internal debate. They become part of how you relate to yourself, not something you have to defend repeatedly. You also begin to see that closure is not something another person gives you. It is something that forms when your mind stops needing them to change in order for you to move forward. That realization can be uncomfortable at first because it removes the fantasy of resolution through external validation, but it also removes the trap of waiting. And once waiting is gone, your energy starts returning to you in ways that feel steady rather than reactive. With time, the emotional charge attached to the past begins to fade, not because it is erased, but because it is no longer actively shaping your present decisions. You can remember without reliving. You can understand without re-entering. That distinction is what allows true detachment to form, not as suppression, but as clarity. And perhaps the most defining moment in this entire process is when your internal world becomes more important than external approval. At that point, the question is no longer, how do I keep this connection alive? But, does this connection allow me to remain whole? That shift alone changes everything. Because once your sense of self is no longer negotiable, the old patterns lose their leverage. Not because they stop existing, but because they stop being compatible with who you are becoming. And from there, what once felt like a psychological maze starts to look much simpler. Anything that requires you to abandon yourself is no longer a path forward, and anything that supports your clarity becomes the only direction worth following.